Hi, I'm Catherine, and I'll be doing the presentation for Group 6's documentary. For our film, we watched Frontline's documentary called Left Behind America. The documentary film focuses on the city of Dayton, Ohio, specifically West Dayton. The city used to be thriving, but today is facing a lot of hardships and struggles. Specifically, they're experiencing a large drug epidemic. They have 35% of their people living in poverty, which is 3 times the nationwide rate, and there's a lot of political turmoil. Dayton used to be one of the centers for the American dream, where people there believed that if you worked hard, good things and success would come. It was the center for inventions, patents, big industries, and prosperity. One of the things that led to its downfall was that people became afraid of integration. African Americans became clustered in West Dayton with little resources and no sustainable way to access food. In addition, there was a shortness on jobs. Dayton became no longer attractive for corporate America to invest in big businesses there. In 2008, GM, which was one of the larger companies in Dayton and one of the employers of a lot of its citizens, closed its auto plant. This led to the layoffs of over 2,000 workers and eventually the downfall of the city. Another struggle which Dayton, Ohio was facing was its opioid epidemic. There was a lot of manual labor going on in the car factories, and opioid was a drug often prescribed to help with back pain. Many people got addicted, but also weren't able to afford the medication, so then turned to cartels to get illegal drugs. In addition, cartels selling heroin often came to Dayton in order to sell. Dayton lost a lot of its population and was on track for over 10,000 overdoses in 1 year. Also, people began to move out of the city and they lost over 50% of their population in 50 years. Part of the way which Dayton was brought back on his feet was through immigrants. Immigrants saw the city as a land of opportunity instead of as a dying town. They brought ideas for businesses and began to rebuild. In addition, jobs came back, but the only problem being that families who were once in the middle class, making a stable amount of money per year, began to make minimum wage. The first main point of the documentary is that wealth is not everywhere. Only a handful of people control most of the wealth in this country, leaving every other person to fall behind. Wealth is not equally distributed, and no matter how good of an education you have or how high of a status you have, it can still be hard to live a sustainable lifestyle if you do not have a lot of money. Dayton, Ohio was one place where there was not a lot of wealth. People in other cities and other jobs and in other places have a lot more money than the people in Dayton, and they were left without much help to try to figure things out for themselves. The second main point of the documentary is that the issue in Dayton was not unemployment versus employment, but what kind of jobs people have. Many of the people in Dayton were employed with 1 or more jobs, but they're still unable to put food on the table. Most people who were going to the food shelves would have a certain time they'd have to go because of work. That meant that they were still working and still having an income, but the jobs were simply not paying enough for them to be able to support their families. The third point is the cause of the first, which is that America has never felt the need to help cities that are no longer thriving. Many cities are left in the dust and left with no money and no resources to get themselves back on their feet. The disparities end up affecting us all. Opportunities are lost and jobs are lost, and people are left without any help and end up living on the streets. It's our job as citizens not to just make sure that the rich get richer, but also help the poor get back on their feet. One concept from the textbook that relates to this documentary is the idea of families after World War II. By the 1950s, the model family had become idealized, which was mostly attainable by white, middle, and upper-class families. Wages dramatically increased during the 1950s, allowing the model of a working man and a stay-at-home mom to become normal. For non-white and lower-class families, this was not normal, and their wages were not increasing. This caused a bigger gap between the rich and the poor. The families in Dayton, Ohio experienced this economic boom with production and industries, but eventually experienced a big downfall after that. Another concept from the textbook which relates to this documentary film is that of inequality in African American families. If the average American woman has 2 jobs, the average African American woman has 3, as she is more likely to be the breadwinner in the family. 25% of African American women outlearn their husbands, which can sometimes lead to domestic violence, substance abuse, and crime, as it puts a strain on the relationship. Also, slavery has left a lasting impact on the family dynamics of African American families. Throughout history, African American families have experienced a lot more hardships than white families. This includes higher rates of divorce, stagnating wages, lower levels of education, and more. Another issue seen in society is the idea of a normal family. This includes a heterosexual couple with dependent children who live in an economically stable household. This needs to be seen as the potential, not as what is expected. A lot of times we see families who look different than that, and they are seen as deviant or wrong. For example, single mothers or families who are struggling financially. Also, after the economic boom of World War II, many African American families lost their jobs and were at higher risk for economic marginalization. Higher rates of incarceration for African American men have led to a scarcity of working males, which can also result in a lot of weight being put on the females. This all relates to Dayton, Ohio, because African American families were economically marginalized in that town. Many of these families ended up living in poverty and turned to things such as drugs or violence in order to make ends meet. One final concept from the textbook that goes along with the documentary is that of single mothers who don't have a lot of money. Single mothers and poverty often go hand in hand and are more prevalent in non-white communities. Many mothers are faced with the decision regarding where to spend their time, meaning going to work or watching their children. In addition, a lot of mothers rely on welfare or choose between that and working for whichever one will provide more for their family. A lot of women who rely on food stamps are working 2 or 3 jobs. Finally, a lot of women have to choose between being a responsible parent or a responsible worker. They have to choose where their time and their priorities go. Oftentimes, this means leaving young children at home on their own and not proper parenting. Mothers who cannot find a sufficient amount of cash will rely on cash from their family or boyfriends. This can cause a strain on those relationships or cause women to be too dependent on other people. A lot of women will take up multiple side jobs or overnight jobs to be able to afford housing and food. Some will even turn to criminal activity such as prostitution and drug dealing in order to earn money. In Dayton, Ohio, a lot of mothers would come into the food shelves with all of their children. The workers at the food shelves said it saddened them because they're very likely to see these same children all grown up at the shelter in 20 years. The cycle of poverty within single-parent families can be a very hard cycle to stop and come with a lot of consequences for both the parents and the children. 3 final takeaways from the documentary are that in order to help our country thrive, we cannot just focus on helping the rich get richer. This just creates a bigger gap between the rich and the poor. Many people are left without help and are told to figure things out for themselves. This can lead to other issues such as poverty, drug use, domestic violence, and more. We need to help make sure all citizens are thriving and economically stable. Another takeaway is that the land of opportunities is not full of opportunities if we are shutting cities out of the picture. In the documentary, when the immigrants came over from Europe, they saw Dayton as full of opportunities for new businesses and more growth. American citizens need to see all cities as having this potential as well. We cannot give up on people and places. A final takeaway is that marginalized groups will stay marginalized until help is given. If there are not significant resources to help people or cities get back on their feet, they will not be able to do so. Throughout history, the same groups have been marginalized and end up in poverty. We need to stop this cycle. It is the job of citizens who do have the resources to help bring others out of that state.